I'm Reverend Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Where are our prophets now? Where are those messages God chooses to communicate divine revelation through? In the past, the Creator has sent prophets like Abraham, Siddhartha, Jesus, Muhammad, and many more. Maybe our higher power has switched tactics since we reinterpret God's words as soon as the Creator's prophets leave us. Could it be that Spirit talks to each one of us individually and we haven't learned to listen? On Words of the Prophets, our modern prophets show us how to find the internal prophet that is the I Am, and we discuss the application of spiritual principles in all aspects of our lives. Love and light, everybody. I'm Reverend Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Today our guest is Reverend Dr. Richard Murphy. Father Murphy is the rector of St. Bede's Episcopal Church here in Santa Fe. Welcome aboard again.
Reverend Phil, it is good to be back here again.
Great to have you. We're going to break our record for shows we did on radio with TV. Another story for another time. Today's prophetic topic is "Let your light so shine." And this phrase can be found in the Gospel according to St. Matthew, the King James Version, chapter 5, paragraph 16. The entire paragraph reads as follows: "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." This statement is a part of the Sermon on the Mount, which starts at chapter 5, paragraph 1. And today, Father Murphy and I are going to discuss the Sermon on the Mount, but more specifically, the Beatitudes, which are paragraphs 3 through 12. And we're going to have Father Murphy's commentary, and I'm going to be reading some stuff and talking about some stuff, and it's coming from a number of sources. But two of them, primarily, they're two books. One is Emmet Fox's Sermon on the Mount, The Key to Success in Life, which was published in 1934, and Swami Prabhavananda's The Sermon on the Mount According to Vedanta, which was published in 1963. So anybody interested in those books, a little bit more about them or publishers, email me. That gives out at the end of the show, and I'll be happy to supply you with the information. So let's set the pace for this. Tell us about the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes, and why are we doing this?
I think the Sermon on the Mount, Reverend Phil, the sermon is probably one of those pivotal moments in the life of the New Testament, in the life of Jesus. One of the things that, as you were remarking on your commentators there, I couldn't help but think that years ago, sometimes more than I want to remember, I was a chaplain in a hospital in New York City, and I worked with a Jesuit, Father Michael Garaffa, who is teaching English now in some Jesuit university, who would remark to me every once in a while, "Murphy, you see the world differently than everybody else." So, and we would have some great discussions. And it's true that I probably look on the Sermon on the Mount somewhat differently than the commentators that you had just mentioned, in that I see it in two things. I see, one, that there was never, I don't believe, that Jesus set time aside to preach one sermon. I think that, for one thing, these are themes that Jesus weaved throughout his ministry, because they kind of encapsulate what he was doing when he was coming to announce the kingdom. For instance, if you read in Luke's gospel, which is the parallel to this, it's the Sermon on the Plain. And in Matthew, it becomes the Sermon on the Mount. And I also see it as through the eyes of, oftentimes, the analysis of history and politics, as much as I do see spirituality. He's transforming the world. He's speaking to a peasant, probably a peasant society, and he's challenging them to, like that Jesuit said of me, look at the world differently and behave differently.
Let me just back up for a second. Why do you think Matthew gets so much more play than Luke does in this area?
Matthew, that's a darn good question. I think Matthew is oftentimes the more popular gospel versus Luke, insofar as An historian would tell you he's much more rooted in Jewish culture and Jewish tradition and Jewish theology. There's more references to Hebrew Scripture. And simple enough, he, for generations, was thought to have been the first gospel. And, of course, now in the last several decades, folks will, conventional wisdom is that Mark was the first gospel and that Matthew and Luke borrowed extensively, to put it lightly, from Mark. And I don't think it's in Mark. So that it's number one. It's interesting that Luke doesn't get the play that Mark does, or that Matthew does rather, because Luke's is the gospel that was written for the wider world, and Matthew perhaps was writing for specific communities in and around his geographical area, which may have been Antioch, which may have been some part of what's now Israel and Palestine, where various communities had come together, and Matthew's saying to these communities, this gospel is for you, whereas with Luke, he reaches out to Rome. He reaches out to the wider areas of the empire and said, this is your gospel as well, and you don't have to be afraid of it. Those are a couple reasons. First, he's the first gospel, and that he has a specific audience in mind. Other than that, I think I'll leave that to the scholars.
Any of this Beatitudes a repetition of Old Testament, because he is reaching out to the Jews? And if he is, I mean, if Mark, when we did the show on Mark, we didn't talk about the Beatitudes at all, so
right,
I'm pretty sure it wasn't in there.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, is this kind of teaching rooted in Old Testament teaching?
If Matthew in around the year 70, perhaps, again that's up for debate, let's say sometime between 70 and 80, was writing this gospel, okay? This is about 20 some odd years after Paul has died, and Paul being the first Gospels, when, and in Acts of the Apostles, which Luke wrote, when the term Christian is first used. But in referring to the time of Jesus, he is referring not to a new Christian culture. Jesus was Jewish, and he was speaking to a specific Jewish faith community. So Matthew, remembering this or recalling this through oral tradition or a number of ways, is recalling that historical moment. So you could say, in a sense, that all of the Beatitudes could be considered part of Hebrew Scripture, because that's the culture it arose out of. That's when Jesus was speaking. He was speaking as a Jewish teacher.
And that would be more along the lines of the way Judaism was handed down, so to speak.
If you go back to Deuteronomy, if you go back to the times of the Exodus and how Israel is to behave in the new promised land, especially in terms of the admonition to always be kind to the stranger, to the alien, to leave a part of your field in such a way that the alien and the stranger, the immigrant coming in, can take some of the fruit from the trees. There is this whole social consciousness in Deuteronomy, in Exodus, we can say in Numbers, that is played out in Matthew.
And the Beatitudes themselves, why are we starting there? Why is it started there? That sets the tone for the whole.
Well, it's in Matthew, it's in chapter 5, and I apologize for not doing my homework because I don't remember where it comes in Luke, and it's right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and it's done in such a setting that Jesus is, I think what he's doing, to use some modern parlance, is Jesus is establishing a strategic plan. I've come to announce the kingdom. I've come to build up the kingdom beginning here and now. And there are guidelines as to how one goes about building up the community, the kingdom rather, and how one goes about behaving in the kingdom. And the ones who will be rewarded are those who mourn, those who work for justice and peace, righteousness, as King James would say. These are the ground rules that Jesus is setting for the disciples, and also for the wider audiences following him around, because he's moved away from John the Baptist and is establishing a whole new ministry. So he's attracting a wider crowd, but also those original 12 and those original disciples.
And it's setting a whole new tone as opposed to basically the Ten Commandments. It's saying here's a whole different set of guidelines, so to speak.
I don't think it's so much a new set. I think he's enhancing what was established on Sinai with the Ten Commandments. I think he's giving them more meat, more substance. He's saying there's a new order that is coming in. There's a new, let's say, dispensation that's coming in. And in order to understand, because Jesus will say at a point in Matthew and the rest of the Gospels, I haven't come to change the law, but he's also at the same time come to add to it. And being the good teacher that he is instructing his audience, this is some new substance to those original commandments at Sinai. When we came out of the desert, this is a new, in other words, one of the ways to look at the Ten Commandments is God's way of shaping the community of Israel as it goes into the promised land. And God is setting down these 10 rules, these 10 commandments. And Jesus is doing the same thing. He's saying, my new community, my new promised land, which I am calling the kingdom, my reign, God's reign, because Jesus never points to himself but points to God, is saying this is the format. These are the guidelines, not the guidelines, but the parameters and the, to use a real modern term, the paradigm by which you must internalize in order to help me build up the kingdom.
So would I be fair in saying the Ten Commandments were about what not to do in listening to that self-voice, and this is telling you now what to do?
So it's not a bad way of looking at it. A lot of the don'ts came down from Sinai, and I've often wondered if some of the do's were left up there by mistake. It was just too heavy for Moses to carry, so maybe he just brought down the don'ts.
20 commandments.
And Jesus coming along saying these are the do's. That's one way of looking at it, sure.
So let's get right into them. The first one is, and I'll just give, it's going to be chapter 5, and this is paragraph 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. How do you interpret that?
That's one that causes, I think, myself and a lot of people to sort of stop in your tracks. And if you look at it historically, imagine that Jesus is speaking to a peasant class in first century Israel. This is a class of people already who are encumbered by religious taxes, Roman oppression, Roman taxes. Pharisees are telling them they're not living as properly as they should because they can't follow all the rules of proper religious living. And they are subsisting on their land. They're giving away some of their produce in order for some of their income. Now, you and I are in that audience, and we are part of, life is hard enough. And Jesus comes along and says to us, you must be poor in spirit. I would think that would bring you and me straight up. When we begin thinking, we don't need to listen to this guy. We can just go back to the farm. We've got it hard enough, and we have enough. We're poor in spirit enough. I kind of look at it on one level as I believe it would be a Buddhist way of looking at it, that Jesus is asking his followers sort of to empty themselves and to become, if it's possible, more God-conscious than person conscious. That's one way of looking at it. The other thing is that James Douglas, who's a Roman Catholic writer, once wrote a book called The Coming of the Nonviolent God, I believe is the name of it. And part of his thesis, is that he said Jesus came to establish a community of nonviolent resistance. And specifically, he speaks in the book about the Roman occupation, but I also think about a lot of the religious establishment. And Jesus is saying to this peasant gathering, we are going to set up a community that runs counter to the values of those who are oppressing us. And this is part of the new way of living. And what happens here is, this is at the beginning, and I think he fleshes that out through the rest of the Beatitudes. That's Murphy's theology. That's not written in cement, and that's not from Sinai.
That's two things you said. One of them was about very Buddhist in nature, and there's a lot of similarities, I believe, in the life and teachings of Jesus and Buddha. but it was also, I mean, Buddha who established basically his ministry, if you want to call it that, with his sermon in the field.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it was much lengthier, maybe not lengthier, but the Dhammapada was broken down into, I think it was 43 sections, if I remember
You're
correctly.
The expert.
And, you know, I mean, it just, I was wondering if that was an attempt to follow a form of presentation that had already been taken, just to give it some...
You know, there's been a lot of theories over the years that Jesus may have gone to India and may have met the Buddha or become in contact with Buddhists and adapted a lot of his Buddha's spirituality. I come from the school of thought that rejects that. I don't think Jesus left Israel. I don't think he went much further than Jerusalem and Galilee. He had 3 years to accomplish what he needed to accomplish. But what I think happened was that what Buddha teaches, what Jesus taught, and a lot of other religious teachers are teaching some common spiritual realities that exist in everybody. So you don't need, in Jesus' case, to go to India. He's as much in sync with those kind of teachings. For instance, the Dalai Lama in his book, Ethics for a New Millennium, says that wherever he goes in the world, whatever group he speaks to, rich, poor, in between, and regardless of the culture, he said there's two universal strains in the human being that always jump to the fore, and that is that human beings are looking for health and happiness. Now, that's not a denominational thing. That's not a sectarian thing. Those are common inbred desires. And I happen to agree with him. And I think Jesus taps into the human spirit in a very wonderful way, and in my tradition, I believe that in a very incarnational way as God become human. So whether or not he met the Buddha is irrelevant. The fact is that spiritual values are pretty universal. And
that's, well, they'll keep adding to the things. I'm not going to keep doing that. I want to get back to the other. I agree with that. They are. Emmet Fox talks about keys. So a lot of the stuff I'm going to is commentary. He talks about having to know the right interpretation of particular words. You know, and that's what he calls it. You know, Emmet, the Sermon on the Mount, the key to success in life is to learn how to interpret it. And I'm pretty sure this is Emmet Fox's. I've blended some, but I've copied some. And Emmet Fox says, poor in spirit means to be humble without pride or any preconceived ideas.
I think that's a good analysis. I think that one adapts an attitude and a posture of humility, knowing that we're not in charge, that we are not alone in our own life's ministry, that the world doesn't center around us. The sun doesn't rise and set. You know, my mother, God rest her soul, she said it once, she said it a million times in my life, the world is not waiting for you with open arms, and you're going to have to make your own way. And I've remembered those lines lo these many years. And I think Fox is on to something. Humility doesn't mean cowing or almost getting into the fetal position, so to speak. Humility is understanding, in the case of the Sermon on the Mount especially, that you're about Jesus' work. You're about God's work, and that it's not your work that you're about. That's why I often wonder if when he says later on, blessed are the meek, that he's not simply underscoring what he has said in the poor in spirit.
I think all of them do that too. I think if we look at this as eliminating ego, eliminating that sense of self, so without pride or any preconceived ideas. So we're being told, don't think, this is how it's supposed to be done. The question, you don't ask why, you ask how. And that's the sense I get that drifts through almost all of this. It's about the elimination of that self that I believe is gets in the way of our spirit.
I think our regardless of the denomination or tradition, I think our spiritual journey, and you and I have talked about this a lot, at the core of our spiritual journey is a longing and is also a path at the same time of to be one with God. Teilhard de Chardin, the famous Jesuit, said that in his Phenomenon of Man when he talks about the Alpha and the Omega. He's not talking about just Jesus saying it. He's talking about you and I moving from the Alpha, our present historical state, existential state here, to that wonderful time when we're at one with God. And that's what happens, I think, when we cross the river.
And just that humility, wonderful definition I had heard once was that humility is not thinking less of oneself, it's thinking of oneself less.
Yes, yes. I was privileged to have, as a professor in my first year in seminary, Bishop Desmond Tutu, then bishop, now archbishop. And we talked about his courage in going before the white South African government the way he did and being so prophetic in fighting to end apartheid. And he said, oh no, he said, I'm not courageous at all. It doesn't take courage. He said, I just go with the Bible and I wave it in front of him and says, I'm just a messenger. That's an example of humility, that we are God's messengers. He would say God's viceroys. That was an often said expression of his. So that's humility, realizing that you are God's agent, God's
without
viceroy.
Pride or preconceived ideas.
Well, we bring our own ego into it to an extent, and our own fears. Look at Jonah in Hebrew Scriptures. God says, go prophesy to Nineveh, and the first thing he does is get a boat to Spain and can't get out of there. And yet he finally concedes that if he does God's work, he'll be successful. And that's what happens. Not too happy about it, but it does work out for him.
Well, that's what we're here to learn.
Right, right.
So the next one, 5:4. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted.
Sure. I think Jesus was speaking to an audience that perhaps was not constantly, but pretty constantly mourning their poverty, mourning their oppression, mourning the struggle to make it through the day, and all the requirements, both religious and social, that they had to do. At the same time, I think in a contemporary setting, that's a very pastoral thing for Jesus to say, because it's in that state of mourning, I think, whether we recognize it or not, that God is as close to us as we can imagine. And it's in that suffering that the presence, the loving God is with us. So I think it's a very pastoral moment in that sermon.
And the interpretation is comfort means the experience of the presence of God, which is the end of all mourning.
Yeah. Once you realize that you're in God's presence, the mourning is a human thing. We will move through it. We will move through it. And Jesus is saying that you're going to be comforted. Take my word for it.
Yeah, exactly. He sets the parameters real clear. You do this is the result you're going to get. There's no ifs, ands, or maybes. It's like, this is it. Next one, chapter 5, paragraph 5. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth.
Yeah, again, I go back to blessed are the poor in spirit. It's the meek, it's the humble that will finally triumph. Bumper stickers every once in a while says, watch out, the meek are taking over, or something like that. But I think when he's saying that, Jesus is again speaking to a people that don't put your ego in front of you. Let's work together on this.
Yeah. Again, no ego.
And it's not a sign of weakness. It's not a sign of, submissiveness isn't a bad word. It is sort of, submitting to the Godhead is a very good concept. We don't particularly want to hear that in our 21st century context. But I think it's an underscoring of what he's originally said.
And this one, I believe, is Swami Prabhavananda, and it's meek is a perfect willingness to allow the will of God to come about in whatever way divine wisdom considers to be best.
I think that's very good.
Yeah, I mean, black again.
Yeah.
I mean,
And I think anybody in a 12-step program would understand that once you turn your heart and your mind over to God and realize that you're not going to stay clean and sober on your own. I think that's, sometimes I think when I read the Sermon on the Mount, he might have been holding a 12-step meeting. There is that possibility, and everybody said, "Hi, my name is."
Put that
they're sitting there on the side of the mountain, and put the wine over there, and we're going to talk about, where you're powerless, because these poor people would feel powerless, but anyway, it's one way of looking at it.
But it's taking the powerlessness and putting it into an asset, as opposed to people seeing it as a liability.
Amen. I mean, I think you summed up Christ's ministry in a wonderful way, admitting to your powerlessness. His final act of triumph, his final act of success, so to speak, is the cross. And in the eyes of the world, it's a failure. But through that moment, he has reconciled all of humanity to himself. And then after that moment, 3 days later, comes the resurrection. So, yeah.
5:6. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled.
That's, to me, it's blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who work for justice, for peace. Blessed are those who speak for those on the margins. Blessed are those who are punished, so to speak, those who are rejected for speaking for those on the margins, for the homeless, for gays, for women, for all those people who are excluded oftentimes from the mainstream of society. Yesterday's gospel in the Episcopal Church was the story of Bartimaeus, the blind beggar who was healed by Jesus. But the significance of the story, of course, for Bartimaeus was being healed and being able to see again, but the whole story is set in the context of Bartimaeus is sitting at the side of the road. He's sitting on the margins, and then he just runs to Jesus, and Jesus simply says to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And when he says, "I want you to help me see," the miracle happens, but then he says, "Go, your sins are forgiven," and he doesn't go. Bartimaeus moves closer to Jesus. That's blessed are the righteous, those who have moved, and Jesus who has stepped in there to bring those from the margin closer to him. As people in that gospel, by the way, just try to push them out there and say, "Stay away," and not until Jesus said, "Bring them here." People, "Oh, okay, we'll do it."
Yeah, and the righteousness is deliverance from evil and union with God. The hunger and thirst after righteousness is the hunger and thirst for God. When the mind becomes one-pointed and concentrated upon God, we will be filled with righteousness.
I think that's good, but I think I would expand that and to say it's a hunger and it's a thirst for justice, and it's a hunger and a thirst for peace and reconciliation, and it's a process of working and discovering God in the process of that work. I think there's sometimes a danger, and I don't want to overstate it because it shouldn't be, but sometimes there can be a danger in personalizing the Beatitudes too much. As Jesus is calling for transformation of life, he's also saying, live these actions out in order for the world to be transformed, in order for society to be transformed. So there's a certain amount of caution that I would personally give there. It's certainly, as we transform the community, we ourselves are being transformed. Gandhi speaks of a zone of peace that we all must create around ourselves. He says before we go out and create that zone of peace in the wider world, I've often wondered if we don't create those zones at the same time, that what we're doing with ourselves at the same time, because I think grace is working in us. I think God's power, God's Spirit is working in us as we do that, as we transform ourselves. The Spirit, the grace is there to be felt in a wider community.
So as soon as we surrender, we're called upon to serve.
Absolutely.
And that's
absolutely
that's the extension.
Right.
5:7. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. That almost sounds redundant.
I think it is. I'm great at quoting authors and theologians. When I come across that particular passage in Matthew and in Luke, I think of the Salvadoran Jesuit, El Salvador, John Sobrino, who's written in one of his books, whose name title I forget at the moment, that he translates mercy as justice. I think blessed are the merciful, along with justice that calls for us to be a people of compassion, a people of deep felt empathy with our fellow human beings.
One of my teachers, you've met him, Maulana. He's a Sufi saint, is his title. And he talks about that in the Quran there are 99 descriptives of Allah. You know, that attributes is better than descriptives.
Mm-hmm.
And the most important attribute of all is mercy. And he does not have a concept for unconditional love, but he talks about mercy being greater than love. And I think the distinction is that love is about connecting to somebody, and the mercy is that unconditional love where it doesn't matter who this person is. We see them as a child of God, and we act accordingly.
Absolutely. I think he's right on. As you're saying that, I'm thinking that one of the who I think is one of the greatest Anglican theologians in our Episcopal Anglican tradition was a 19th century English priest by the name of Frederick Denison Morris. And Morris was the one who founded such things as the Christian Socialist movement, made a direct impact on the thinking of the church, and I think perhaps is relevant for today. But one of the times in his life, he had spent quite a bit of time as a hospital chaplain at Guy's Hospital in London in the 19th century, probably the mid-19th century. And he said in a lot of his works afterwards that he learned more theology by sitting next to the bed of the sick and the dying in the hospital. And what he was saying, he learned deeply the notion of mercy and compassion, the mercy of love, the quality of love. And he incorporated that later on into his theology and saw that how his theology had social implications. But I think we hear of Jesus in the New Testament constantly, and he had compassion for them, and he loved them, and he had mercy for them. The rich man who goes to him, and Jesus said, well, you know, if you want to follow me, you're going to have to sell all your goods. And the poor guy can't do it. But in that passage is that wonderful statement, Jesus loved him. And in other translations it would read, Jesus had compassion on him.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So next one is 5:8. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And that gets pretty precise.
I've been looking around for people who are pure in heart for a long time. So if you, I think, all joking aside, I think Jesus is calling us to be good. I remember just a personal story when my family and I had moved to New York City in 1984. We enrolled our son in a private school in New York City down in Greenwich Village for a while. And he began in the second grade, and we went to our first parent meeting at the school. And, I was worried about the change and the everything we had gone through, and he was only 7 at the time. And I can still remember, as if it happened 5 minutes ago, his teacher looking at us and saying, your son is a good human being. And I thought that's the finest compliment you can pay to someone, is that they're a good human being. And I think that's what Jesus is saying with the pure in heart. Strive as best as you can to be a good human being.
And again, I think this is Swami Prabhavananda on this one. Pure is to recognize God alone as the only real cause and the only real power in existence. Heart means the part of man's mentality known as the subconscious mind. To see God is to apprehend truth as it really is, and this is infinite freedom and perfect bliss.
I couldn't agree more. I think what he's talking about there in my humble soul is he's talking about once we've reached that moment of enlightenment, of understanding, that aha moment in our lives, then we are close to God, then we're at one with God. And I think it's a beautiful way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean, the pure of heart is, the pure in heart, again, is that going back on these, no pride,
Right.
no selfish motivation, but opening it up, I think, even a little bit further and saying not only are we not just thinking of ourselves, but we're going to just feel and touch that other person. And
it's precisely, it's an other consciousness. Be always conscious of, I mean, we're social. Some scientists years ago, I remember hearing in grammar school, we're rational animals, and then thank goodness somebody came along and says, no, we're not, we're social beings, and I like that one better. So with all due respect to Darwin, but I couldn't agree more, and I think that notion of just goodness and looking on the other, always looking, I think, folks, one of the qualities of pure in heart is always looking for the good in the other. I've often thought, this is one of if my bishop is watching, I'm in big trouble, but anyway, I'll go ahead and say it. I'm not sure there's a final exam when we get to the pearly gates. I kind of think that the door's open and in we go, because we've been loved by God. We've been created by a loving God. And I've often thought, well, if there is a final exam, exactly what would it be? And the only thing I can imagine is Jesus as God looking us in the eye and saying, tell me how you've loved. And we're going to be humble, denigrating human beings, and we're going to think, well, we could have done better. Oh, my goodness. Oh, we weren't as good as we could. We didn't love as much. And then Jesus is going to look at us, and he said, no, let me tell you where I've seen you love, and I've seen the quality of your goodness. I worked 15 years as a probation officer, and we're doing both adult and juvenile probation, and so the best and the worst in humanity, perhaps over 15 years. But at everybody's core, I would even think with some of the really challenging, some of the worst of the worst, you knew that there was a spark of the divine in that person, which just, the pilot light hadn't been lit, but, there was something there.
And it's up to us to see that.
It's up to us to see it and do whatever we can to try and bring it to light, even though sometimes we're not going to succeed, we're not going to be all things to all people. But I think one of the issues of humility along those lines is oftentimes you and I are just stepping stones across the river for a person's transformation. We may be in the middle of the river, and they may be able to get past us, over us, and across to the next stone, and eventually over to the other side. But I think, again, going back to pure in spirit and humility is knowing that we're not the ultimate savior, that we're just part of the process of moving each other along.
So,
which I call redemption.
Singularly, they have a meaning, but they also have a meaning collectively, the Beatitudes?
Sure.
So there's a collective path that we are being guided upon, and a somewhat common message that says, get out of self and go help somebody.
Again, I go back to Morris in good old 19th century Victorian England, that his theology crystallized when he became aware that doing theology, which is articulating God, was best understood as a basis for social transformation.
Definitely social transformation, right. Yes.
And then people came along after him. I mean, that movement kind of waxed and waned over the decades, and there's still some elements of it left in England now, for the Labour Party, for one thing. But here in this country, I think some of our basic democratic principles, some of our basic liberal principles, some of our basic progressive principles arise out of that consciousness that our spirituality, our holiness, our work here is only complete when we use it as a transformative agent.
Definitely. 5:9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. And that's a powerful statement too.
That's, that's one of, to me, and other folks I'm sure would come along and argue otherwise, and that's what makes the world go around. But to me, that's one of the core statements that Jesus makes, that you and I are called to be peacemakers, to be reconcilers, to be people that offer hope to the world. We're prisoners of hope, as Paul would earlier say. And fundamentally, in order to build up the kingdom, in order to build up God's reign, that we, as you say, the social dimension, the collective dimension, is accomplished in building peace and reconciliation.
And it's interesting. I had a feeling that you were going to, knowing you and how you, peace and reconciliation. But and again, I think this one is probably also Swami Prabhavananda. Peacemakers are the ones who realize their oneness with God and with all beings. Only when we become illumined by the unitive knowledge of God do we really become God's peacemakers and God's children. The illumined soul has no ego. So I think, it's that, I interpret this and see it in that context of the oneness and the quietness and stillness that one tries to obtain in meditation. And that's the peace. We're just nothing else, you're one with. Mm-hmm. And from that emanates everything else.
And I would look on that too as saying that we are at one with God, because I think pretty much what Swami says I can agree with, but it doesn't end at the personal. The illumined light. And the other thing I think of quite a bit within that particular beatitude is the African notion of Ubuntu, that I only know myself through you, that I only know myself through the other. We get to know ourselves, our self-understanding in our relationship, the philosophy of Ubuntu would say, through interrelationships. Carry that through to the spiritual dimension of I only know myself through God's eyes, as well as I know myself through the community's eyes. That, I think, is at the core of what peacemaking is about, that we see ourselves through the eyes of God. You and I are created in the image of God. When we look at each other, we are looking at God's image. So I think to that extent, that to me it's a twofer, you might want to say, that we're getting to know God as we're getting to know each other. That doesn't take away, though, from that personal meditative process. I mean, we all have to have. I have times of prayer every day in which I must be alone with God and just offer up some prayers, and at the same time, just let those prayers take hold of me. Let the spirit of those prayers, let the spirit of Scripture sink deep into my soul.
Only when we become illumined by the unitive knowledge of God do we really become God's peacemakers and God's children.
Once we know ourselves through God's eyes, we've got a deeper self-understanding.
Yeah.
Again, it's go back. He might have been holding a 12-step meeting. Once we reach that moment of acceptance of an addiction as a disease, once we accept that we have that disease, once we accept, the next step is that we turn our lives over to God, and we do that by understanding ourselves through God's eyes. And I think it's perfect. So
12-step.
I think he was in a meeting room someplace.
12-step, having had a spiritual
awakening. So maybe it should be the sermon in the meeting room. What do you think?
Well, I mean, there is a segment in the original AAs that followed Emmett Fox's works and used his writings as before they wrote their own book.
Right. Yeah.
That was the more liberal segment as opposed to the fundamentalist segment, which wanted to make this a purely Christian fellowship, the 12 steps.
Well, you take the higher power as you understand it.
Yeah.
And then again, going along with the Sermon on the Mount, going along with the 12 steps, you reach that 12th step. What are you doing? You're carrying your message to someone else. And what you're doing is what Jesus did. You're telling others your story of your own recovery and hoping that through that experience, someone else's life will be transformed. And when you transform that life, the life of those around that person are also changed over a period of time.
You carry the message and you demonstrate its reality by your own behavior.
Exactly.
You don't act differently than what you're preaching.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. We
got 3 more to go, and a lot of the places kind of lump them together, and I'm just going to read them and then we can talk about them. So 5:10 is, "Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake." And 5:12 is, "Rejoice and be exceeding glad." I think that's exceedingly glad. "For great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you."
That's a part of the Beatitudes, I think, that if you and I were sitting there as disciples, we might begin to think life in a fishing village wasn't so bad after all. And we may want to head back there because Jesus is simply saying, you're going to be punished. You're going to pay a price for living out these Beatitudes. And, you know, I mean, I immediately think of persecution. In Jesus' context, he's speaking to a society that's already is being so persecuted, whether it's by the religious establishment or whether it's by the political establishment. These people know persecution. They don't need to be told it. But it's no different here than a homeless person, than someone being shoved to the side of the road like Bartimaeus, such as a gay person, or a woman being pushed, who knows that she's being persecuted. That's a tough pill to swallow for a lot of folks, but at the same time, that again, that going back to the notion of hope, that persecution can turn into joy, can turn, not the persecution itself, but that persecution can be ended and can be transformed. And God bless you, Jesus is saying, for going through that. You know, you deserve all the blessings and love and compassion and mercy that I can give you and that God can give you. And it's a profound thing. On a social political context, Jesus is saying, like a Desmond Tutu going in there and waving his Bible and saying, I'm just a messenger. He's saying to us, you're going to be messengers. And you're going to speak on behalf of the homeless. You're going to speak on behalf of gays. You're going to speak on behalf of women who are marginalized. And this is going to come with a price because there are those who aren't going to listen to you.
And, you know, paragraph 10 and paragraph 12, it talks about, in 10 it says, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And in 12 it says, great is your reward in heaven. So basically, he's setting the tone for the rest of his ministry.
Right.
Saying, you know, here's what's going to happen to me.
Right.
Probably going to happen to you if you walk this path. But what I've told you up until now was, don't listen to that voice that limits you. Listen to this voice that doesn't limit you. And what you get as the reward, so to speak, will more than outweigh what it is that you've suffered.
Yeah, and what, you know, there's a subtext here, too, that people would hear. And this is why I think that Jesus did say, preach, convey the Sermon on the Mount throughout his whole ministry. Just didn't say, let's go away to a mountainside or let's get down here in the plain. That the authors of the gospel did that for the sake of their, you know, their literary purpose. But that this is a way of life. And Jesus is instilling in people that a fact of life, I think, with Jesus' ministry. He's saying, heaven begins here. The kingdom begins here. The reign begins here. And as much as you suffer, there is a road to happiness and liberation and release here and now. And it may not seem that way sometimes, but the road ahead isn't as bleak as it looks, because the kingdom has already begun. And I think that's the subtext, and that's why Jesus, his whole ministry was devoted to healing, to teaching, but to preaching the kingdom, to pointing out to God, to pointing away from himself to the kingdom. And this did not happen in one instance on the side of a mountain or sitting on the plain. This was for Jesus, this was his lifelong ministry. This is his lifelong message, rather. So, because you're in the circumstances of those folks that heard it, and you're in the circumstances of a lot of people in our society and our own community today. That's when you want to look to see if life in a fishing village, you ought to give it a second thought. So, but Jesus is saying, as Jesse Jackson said so long ago, keep hope alive.
Yeah.
But concretely, live out that hope.
And as long as you hold true to these teachings, it's all going to be okay.
I think he's okay to the extent that you're going to be able, it's possible, I don't want to say it's okay in the sense of everything's going to disappear for so many. It doesn't, especially look at the economic crisis we're in now and folks losing their homes and whatnot and jobs. But Jesus is saying, don't let go of me. I think essentially, don't let go of me, don't let go of God, don't let go of my vision, my dream, my passion. And
in none of these Beatitudes is Jesus really promising instant gratification.
No, he never promised us the rose garden.
Exactly. So, I mean, even in these economic times, if we hold to those principles, we're going to get through them in better shape. It doesn't mean we're going to have more money or the millionaire's going to knock on our door and hand us a check.
I think that's absolutely what you're saying is absolutely right on. And I also think at the same time, Jesus is saying, through a subtext, let's say, the subliminal message in the Beatitudes are that you're loved and you're needed by me and you are an important person. And these are the qualities I would like to pass on to you. I'd like to see you live. But I think we have to see in that message, too, the fact that, especially when he talks about suffering, when he talks about persecution, he is saying, you're not alone, and more concretely, you are loved and continuously loved by me, even when you think I'm not there with you, because that's when I'm the closest to you. That wonderful poem of was on the beach walking.
Oh yeah,
on the beach.
Footsteps.
Yeah, footsteps. In those deepest, darkest moments of your life, it was me that was carrying you. I think that's part of this the underlying message to the Sermon on the Mount.
It's a rather lengthy. I'm going to read this. I think it's pretty good. Of those last three, so it says, worldly people do not understand the value of the spiritual life. Often they mock the spiritual individual, and sometimes they revile them and try to do injury to them. The spiritual person does not react to this. Their mind is fixed in God. Therefore they feel the unity, they see the ignorance, and they are merciful. But whether the individual is criticized or harmed, they do not compromise. They do not choose to please worldly people. A really spiritual person knows that if they have to go contrary to the whole world for the sake of God, they will do it. The reward to the illumined soul who does not react to any injury done to them is immediate, because they know that heaven is always present within them as well as without, even in this life.
I can't help but think that you and I sitting here in Santa Fe in the 21st century, even with the economy the way it is and whatnot, you and I have it pretty comfortable. And we haven't suffered for our spiritual beliefs, but there are places, whether it be China for Falun Gong or the Middle East for not thinking one way or the other. I once worked with a fellow who was a refugee from Albania who was brought in here by the government and said, America's such a wonderful country. And he said, America's been so good for me, but you have not suffered. And he said, I see the results of that oftentimes. And we worked in the courts together.
Yeah.
And so what would happen to young people. So, sure.
And we kind of got them all in.
Wow, we did it.
So before we run out of time.
What a good team we are, huh?
We did it. You want to let people know how to reach you?
Reach me at St. Bede's Episcopal Church, 982-1133. Services are on Sunday at 8 and 10:30 and Wednesdays at 12:15.
982-1133.
982-1133. And as we say, we welcome traditional and non-traditional families.
Okay. Let me make a couple announcements and we'll give you a parting thought.
Okay.
My contact information will roll at the end of the show. There's a phone number, there's an email address, there's a website. If you want to get a hold of me, use one of those contacts to get a hold of me with. I do spiritual counseling, so we talk about some of the stuff that Father Murphy and I talked about today, and we talk about how do I apply that in one's life, and that's what this is about. How do I deal with those adverse situations? Because, in spite of what this guy says, we know the pain we know, and that's the only thing we react to. And if you're having trouble and you think I could be of some help, be happy to work with you. I will have a donation basis, sliding scale, and give me a call. Next week we're going to have, I guess he's emeritus now. He's kind of in semi-retirement. Archbishop Richard Gundry. We're going to talk about non-Roman Catholic Church and what it does and what it practices here in Santa Fe. So tune in next week for that. And you got a parting thought for us?
Parting thought is a homework assignment to folks to take some time and find some quiet space and sit down with the Beatitudes, both the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, and let these teachings sink in deeply. And as you're doing that, remember that you are loved and you are needed.
I agree with that. I think that's a wonderful homework assignment. And you're not going to be quizzed on it.
Not graded. No.
Yeah, really. But I mean, and again, I'm at Fox. The key to success in life is to take these basic skills, these basic teachings, make them skills,
right.
Implement them in your life, and watch how much better your life gets. And maybe it's my own bend, but like you were talking, 12-step program, it's about every one of these religions that I look at in one form or another teaches us get out of self, get out of ego, listen to that voice inside that is spirit. The kingdom of God is within, and you'll be guided rightly, and you'll have a better life for it, regardless of what you do or do not have.
Recovery's possible.
Always, always. So, until next week, I thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show as much as we did doing it. And know that you are divine. Know that you can create a reality that works for you. All you've got to do is want to do it and let somebody show you. Read the books, go to the teachers, and you'll be amazed at what life could be like. So until next week, love and light, blessings to you all. I'm Reverend Phil, and I've been your host for Words of the Prophets. Thank you for tuning in. Please join me again next week, same time, same channel, for more Words of the Prophets.